Right.
Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul and Strategy, and this is Tosca. I love following colleagues for many years, following their work over a long period and staying connected. Jayanta Bora is one of those colleagues. He and I met first some, I'm going to guess, 12 plus years ago when he had a senior leadership role in people and culture at a major development NGO. And we started working together on a senior leadership training program. Jayanta developed an intense interest in feminist leadership at that time and has since deepened his work on that. He's also a seasoned expert in organizational leadership and management and change, and I'll say something more in a moment. And when he told me recently that he, together with others, had developed an actual competency framework for feminist leadership, I knew I wanted to interview him about that. I felt the need for a long time now to pin down what are the actual behaviors attached to feminist leadership so that we can, one, truly see if we can distinguish feminist leadership from other forms of transformational leadership, and two, whether we can go beyond the principles and values behind the model and get clear on how we see feminist leadership in action. So together today, we're going to explore the core principles of feminist leadership, but we're also going to bust some common myths that often cloud the conversation. And just want to say also that Jayanta writes regularly on LinkedIn about organizational development, change management, feminist leadership, and AI. So I strongly recommend you follow him on LinkedIn about these topics. So with that, Jayanta, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Tosca. It's first of all, thank you for giving this opportunity. I think it's a fantastic podcast. I've been following some of the earlier ones, and I just, was kind of bringing my thoughts together about this one because it's something very specific. At the same
Yes.
time, it's something which obviously I'm very passionate about, and so are you. I think in a sense for the sector. Um, so yeah, I'm just kind of looking forward to the conversation. There are a lot of insights, I think, specifically to draw upon, practice. I also teach. I'm a professor of practice in management institutes, teaching executive MBA students, and I
Yeah.
teach organizational culture and leadership. So one thing for certain in leadership, in a corporate parlance, they will never talk about feminist leadership models. Never.
Mm.
They will only talk about all the others. Laissez-faire to transformational leadership, transactional leadership, what do you mean, servant leadership, 360 leadership, but not feminist leadership. I make it a point to introduce feminist leadership as a model in these courses because
Mm.
that's where we need to start. People need to understand this is a very evolved practice, leadership practice, I mean, amongst all the others. So,
Mm.
yeah, so I'm very happy to be here.
Good.
And if insights can help people or, kind of add value to their practice element, nothing could be more rewarding than that. So thanks again,
Absolutely.
Oscar.
You're so welcome, Jayanta, and I'm so grateful for the collaboration and partnership and collegiality that you and I have celebrated for quite a few years. So, listeners, please let me introduce briefly Jayanta's background a little bit more. He has 3 decades in the people and culture arena, organizational development, organizational behavior, and human resources. For instance, Jayanta, unlike me, is a real expert in human resources. He has done career development coaching, diversity and inclusion work, team building, training, you name it. There strategic planning, leadership development. As Jayant just mentioned, he is a visiting faculty member for executive MBA programs at several programs in India. And he used to be the executive director for human resources at Plan International. He was the head of OD, Human Resource and Operations, also in other NGOs. He worked at ChildFund. He worked at Oxfam, a very distinguished career. So, Jayanta, let's get going. So, how did you first get interested in deepening your understanding or even starting your understanding, like all of us, right? I too started at a certain point deepening your understanding of feminist leadership and what it means for development organizations such as NGOs?
I think it's a very interesting question, Tosca. So I think go back to when we first met in the SLDP. I still remember that was Arusha, Tanzania,
Yeah,
ActionAid Training Center. You, along with, I forget now, Professor, but Syracuse University, I remember, you all anchored the. So we spoke about leadership then. And there was one question, very interesting question, is that, is leadership about, does one size fit all? In a sense, with the kind of work actually it does, you know, um, and that was something which, kind of struck because actually, in terms of, the work that it did, it was ahead of the curve in terms of, coming to global south, in the redistribution of power, in terms of collaborative effort, all the elements of the power with, power to, power, power, power within. Um, but I think my interest, I think in way we spoke about it then, but my interest actually comes from my roots. I come from a matrilineal space, so that is just the opposite of patrilineal, but not patriarchy. So matrilineal doesn't necessarily means matriarchy. I actually have written on LinkedIn on that. But just to understand the status of women, first of all, one, two, the power they wield, and three, so what does matrilineality mean in terms of,
yes.
the space and culture? So then this whole element of power and the whole patriarchal system and, elements of, inequality, harmful social practices, all those elements in one way or the other, had actually a solution. A solution was, of course, I think coming from the feminist movement, but a solution was on if you could embrace feminist principles in your practice, in your operations, in your leadership practice, and actually build a organization that has a feminist culture. So that was very interesting to me because one thing that struck me was at that point in time that this feminist leadership practice is not about males and females. It is
Right.
far, far beyond that. It is a leadership practice. There are foundational principles that strictly, kind of abide to the fact of fighting inequality, fighting patriarchal ecosystems, the power structures, deep structures, all of those elements together. So for me, that was very interesting. Maybe a little bit of the lineage from matrilineal society, where of course women had much higher status. And the interesting part was all the males there where I came from, they would marry and they had to go to the bride's house. They had to take, their kids would take the bride's, title. The youngest
Mm.
daughter would get all the property.
Mm.
So very interesting. And then, of course, they had male clubs that they organized against domestic violence because they seems the wives is to beat them and so forth. So childhood, those images, I think in one way or the other, really kind of pushed me to the fact to say, like, is feminist principle really about, replacing the patriarchal element through matriarchy? Actually, that interested me a lot. And yeah, I've come to the conclusion that absolutely it's not. It's not that, feminist principles and feminist leadership practice actually it stems very strongly from the matriarchal system in a way. It's actually more about the intersectionality, about the power and so forth. Yeah, so that's the interest
Interesting.
actually I
It
have.
really comes from your childhood and what you observed, but also how the values you saw in
Yeah,
practice, right?
yeah,
Can I just say for a moment before we go into to what extent feminist leadership is one form of transformational leadership and how you would characterize it within, but in those early days when the NGO sector started getting exposed to feminist leadership, etc., in the NGOs that you and I collaborated with, I saw in the very beginning, understandably so, but still it was confusing. It caused organizational confusion. Some people thought feminist leadership was about women in development, which it isn't, not necessarily at least. Some thought it was about women in leadership, which is also not, definitely not only at all. And some had some understanding of feminist leadership. So, but that confusion, I remember in the early days, for instance, in the case of ActionAid, but not only there, caused a lot of muddiness. Do you remember that
yes,
early era?
yes. Yes.
Any comments on that?
I think it's very interesting. Not only it's only about the global South and North. In fact, they have very different views of feminist leadership practice or feminist principles and feminist organizations. That was
Who
the
is
most
they?
interesting. Global North and Global South. So
Oh, really?
distinct
Tell me.
difference, yes. In terms of also, for example, let's say organizationally, you wanted to embody feminist principles and feminist leadership practice. The North look at it very differently. They would look at it, how this would impact our image, what would be the optics, and most likely it will actually bring a slump in our fundraising because this
Oh,
is not
really?
something that we, yeah, very interesting. And and rightly so, because in the global South, of course, it was embedded practice, but in a sense, they were not raising funds. So obviously, that permutation and combination actually was kept out. But if you look at it in a way, even today, there is very limited research that we have actually on the efficacy, let's say, a proper longitudinal research on efficacy of
Exactly.
feminist leadership
Yeah.
that impacts an organization's effectiveness, the OE part of it, overall operations, finances, your entire people, but fundamentally the organization's culture, high performing culture. But
Yes.
a very interesting part to it is research has shown women-led organizations are far successful than men-led organizations. But the assumption here is not necessarily those women-led organizations are feminist leaders. They
Right.
practice any form of leadership. So I think that I think is very interesting in terms of just the basic understanding of what feminist leadership or principles mean. And of course, coming from a patriarchal mindset, men, and specifically I can say that because I am one, we do have the bias to say that anything to do with word feminist or
Mm-hmm.
feminist leadership or
Mm-hmm.
feminist principles is
Mm-hmm.
essentially for women. So if we get into that arena, it's like they wouldn't want to because first of all, I think it's a arena that they are not, kind of what you can say. It's a blind spot for them, not
Mm-hmm.
known to them, but known to others. So it's a blind spot. It's not an arena like known to others, known to or to self. So there's a whole notion about self-awareness, and therefore it's basically then the woolly stuff comes around and all the discourse that this stuff doesn't work. It's only for women, and well, it sounds good. It's it's well, quote unquote, the fad to have. So those elements come into play.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's an interesting one, yeah.
Yeah, it is, and there's much more we could say now, but I'm gonna restrain myself and first ask you, so how do you define feminist leadership from a practice perspective? And we're going to go in a moment into the competencies around it from a more human resource as a function perspective. But in a nutshell, how would you define
Yeah.
feminist leadership and where does it fit in the different schools of transformational leadership?
So I think I was doing some work the other day in terms of looking at all leadership models, situational leadership, as I said, transformational, transactional, servant leadership, laissez-faire, 360, you know. And I was looking at feminist leadership in terms of, okay, let's do a basic mapping of how what is fundamentally different of these leadership models to do with and feminist leadership model.
Yeah.
And one fundamental difference is the context. You cannot actually certify someone, like it's like to say that, yes, you're a feminist leader without the context, because it's all about context. You have a lot of certifications in other leadership practice, 360 leadership practice. You'll have it's like getting a certification for, let's say, 7 habits for highly effective people.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, then they'll start with begin with the end in mind, all right, yeah, okay, be proactive, okay, right. Putting first things first. Yeah, sure. But what does it mean? So I think that element is something which is very evolved in a feminist leadership practice.
But I
So
need to pin that down a little bit more, Jayanta.
yeah,
When you say it's what's the distinguishing fundamental difference is that the context. What tell us more about how does the context come into play in feminist leadership in a way that is not characteristic for other transformational leadership? I'm not skeptical. I'm just asking how you
and
see
no, no,
that.
absolutely. I think it's a very important question. It's a very interesting question. So fundamentally, let me only put it this way. feminist leadership, if you were to embrace, if you were to embed, then be careful of just one thing. This is not about putting on a system like a cloud-based financial system and things will run as usual or will improve us. No, it will turn the organization upside down on its head because
Oh,
it is about disruption. It is about, you know, what you can say, counter power. It is about assessing power. It's about devolving power. It's about, challenging the ecosystem, the patriarchal ecosystem, the whole element of, let's say, harmful practices to all the other elements that, that of course, yeah, the starting point is from a gender justice, because obviously, as you know, I mean, today we have what, 135 years in a gender gap. So another 135 years, both of us won't be there to, they
right.
say that, to even get to that parity. So I think with the traditional leadership practice and other models, they don't look at the context. It is not important who holds power in the organization, as long as that power is the what we call it as the relevant power, or it is the authoritative power, or visible power. They're not even interested in invisible power and hidden power. They're not interested in the whole element of the power with and power to and power within and power over and the whole power dynamics. In corporates, they're not interested in understanding deep structures in terms of men's club or understanding, even organizational politics, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But feminist leadership, actually, that is the context. Where is the power? And how do we dismantle the patriarchal structures of this power? How do we devolve power? How do we bring subsidiarity? How do we ensure that we actually, kind of build collaboration, through the power with, and, essentially impact everyone for the power within, and in one way or the other, empower, the right people with the resources, information, with the authority, with the accountability to actually, practice them from the power to factor, how they transfer that. And then, of course,
Mm.
power over, which is there, and that is the counter power I was talking about. So, in feminist leadership, power over actually is counter power to a large extent, in a way it's looked at.
What do you mean
And
by counter?
therefore, counter power, it builds counter power. And that's like, yes, I will use all mechanisms in my right as a HR, human rights defender, let's say, or in terms of using all elements that is necessary here, legally, and legislatively, statutes in the sphere of influence to bring about that change. If not, in a case where you're able to change mindsets in a way that there is the culture change. So that I think is extremely important. So feminist leadership journey is about actually a change journey, a culture change journey, and it cannot embed in 1 year or 18 months. No, it takes time, 3 years, at least 6 years, and then we see results. And that is why I think there is no research. There is no evidence, empirical evidence between these two. The practice of feminist leadership and the impact on, let's say, your organizational effectiveness
Because there's no
overall.
longitudinal research yet, you're
No,
saying.
no, there is none.
Yeah, yeah. Why, by the way, do you think that feminist leadership has experienced a bit of a surge, is maybe a big word, but a surge in interest, at least from development nonprofits? What explains that?
So I think couple of points. So there are organizations who obviously have embedded and practiced feminist leadership and are feminist organizations, for ages now, many years. And but there are many who kind of onboarded late, and in the continuum curve, I think they've come late in a sense. And there are various reasons for them to onboard. I mean, one interesting reason I thought was because it sounded good, because
Yeah,
it was like a fad,
yeah.
and little realizing what actually were the implications. So that's
Mm.
one. Two, I think, is, yeah, absolutely, in terms of if your strategy and if your vision and your values and your mission is talking about inequality, it's talking about, looking at dismantling patriarchal, power bases and structures, and kind of attempting to bring about a sense of inclusivity, collectivity, that whole collectivism. Then they would go and kind of embrace that and take the leadership on. And then, of
It
course, the third one is by default. that they are a feminist organization, the kind of work they do, and that is an important thing to qualify. So these organizations are organizations that are built on, solidarity movements, like the entire power width of the feminist principle in terms of the power factor. So these are coalitions, and they have factored this. Of course, those are more, the lens is more through the gender lens. That is the entry point. But feminist leadership, as we know, or practice or principles are intersectional in terms of the intersectionality, which is like,
Yeah.
that is why it makes it very, very challenging. Because, yeah, take gender itself. Let's look at the intersectionality of gender. Between that, you have white and black and Asian and, minorities. And within that, you have, perhaps gay, lesbian, LGBTQI, that kind of. Then within that, you have income. Within that, you have geography. Within that, you have race. Within that, you have
Class,
ethnicity,
education.
class,
Mhm.
language. So just kind of, if you slice dice, even to look at the intersectionality, it is humongous. It is, and we are dealing with, this is not like some manufacturing process that we, kind of check on some of the quality factors and assembly line and everything sets in. No, this is about a constantly evolving context. And that is why I feel, and that is why I'm again reiterating, many people, they say that they are feminist leaders and they want to embrace, and I would be so happy, and I would actually, kind of obviously, support and be of help of any way that I could. But when they say it in pretense, in a way, because without realizing what it means, then that is a danger. That is where I think a lot of the brand of feminist leadership and feminist principles, feminist organizations get diluted, because
Mm.
your, affect done on verb, as we say, deeds, not words. And one principle, I think I feel strongly about feminist principle, and I feel, it's something which I see it, because feminist leadership is not about the position you hold. It's not about where you sit. It is about what you do. So action, not words. So I think that's a very important point of feminist leadership. And, and to, of course, call out if something is wrong, challenge it. And obviously build a coalition, the entire power with to challenge that, to keep, capitalize on the power within, and to, kind of have that whole traction from the power too, and then
Okay.
build a counterpower. So that's where I think is the brand of feminist leadership at times is misplaced, um, because I think many people, I feel, still take it on without understanding the real implications.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that's why
they have
I'm
to be.
interested about, because I want to learn more about the
Mhm,
real implications. I don't feel I know enough about and understand enough about that.
mhm,
So you
mhm.
already ventured into a little bit some of the myths around feminist leadership.
Yeah,
One, you mentioned that it's only for women. Um,
yeah.
that Can you just kind of quickly tick through a few other myths that you have articulated also in your writing, right? That you
Yeah.
think are often muddying the field.
Right. I think I'll, yeah, quickly just recall. So one you already touched upon, the the fame, the feminist leadership is only for women. Oh yeah, that's only for women. Normally you get that thing. And why are we, kind of onboarding something which is so women focused, but actually it's not. So fundamentally, it's feminist leadership is about equity, power sharing, ensuring that whole process of inclusivity, that perhaps other leadership models also have. But the question here is about the status quo of male-dominated leadership structures. So actually, feminist leadership questions that status quo, and the fact that men would always have this, because there's an underlying fear that feminist leadership will dilute authority or undermine male leadership. So
Mm,
that is why they always say, "Hey, this is for women," because that is that underlying fear of the patriarchal structure. There's the underlying fear of the conditioning of men, and of course, women also, by the way, because there are many women who practice patriarchy, by the way. I remember,
yeah.
bless her soul, Kamala Bhasin, one of the, she was an activist, and obviously Kamala Bhasin, I'm sure, and did a lot of work on women rights and gender. She said, in my life, I have seen more women practice patriarchy than the fact that there are many men who are actually practice feminist leadership.
Mm,
So that element is also there, I guess, in terms of that. Yeah, it is only for women, and they make it. And if some elements of those seep into, the culture, then they try to say that, this is something which will dilute authority and undermine it. So that's the first one, which I think is basically on conditioning our entire mindset. Two, I think it's too soft for the real decision making. And this is, I think, again, coming from the whole element of the bias that feminist leadership is too soft for real decision making. I think it's just the opposite, actually. That, yeah, that because this comes from, where does it come from? Like, I remember, was it Mark Zuckerberg? Yeah, he spoke about that we need more of masculine energy, in leadership practice and in the way that we run organizations. But actually, it's just the opposite, because what that means is, um, because feminist leadership is too soft, therefore we need to give it a dosage of masculine energy. And then what happens after that? Well, in a corporate sector, there has been research, and there's some good research now done in insurance and finance sector, for example.
Yeah.
Women leaders who are promoted to leadership roles started to behave like men in terms
Yeah.
of their dress, for example, in terms of the fact that they actually kind of bring in that aggression, because that's what, well, it's labeled as aggression, while men who exhibit the same is labeled as strong leadership. So I think
That's
that's
real
that's
leadership.
beautiful. And then,
Yeah.
of course, that's a role congruity theory, as we call it. And then the important one, I think, is the queen bee syndrome. You know, whereby women of senior positions, they distance themselves from women and female colleagues and only stick to the male-dominated leadership spaces.
Mm.
So that whole notion, but is flawed. As I said, research has consistently shown women-led organizations often outperform male-led ones, and the
Yeah.
fact that feminist leaders can't make tough decisions, I think, is basically the most I would say, what underrated statement.
Mm.
They have the entire element of power. They understand power, and the decisions they make are obviously decisions that are collaborative. It is not hierarchical, and it's a collective decision, but they're able to take the decision and make it in a way that obviously impacts everyone positively and to everyone's best interest. So that thinking is something which we need to look at. That, yeah, it is soft, and basically they can't take hard decisions. The third one, I think, is about that feminist leadership is only about gender issues. As you said,
Mm.
women in development, then it went to gender in development, and then but that is actually that whole narrow reading of feminism is solely gender equality. Yes, there is gender justice, and that is, I think, a very important facet. As we said, the gender gap is only around 125 years, so obviously, why not? It has to be, but it's deeply intersectional, as I said, and
Yeah.
and we discussed that. So it's about power, privilege operating across multiple dimensions. As you said, race, class, disability, all of the elements, geopolitical inequalities, and I think leadership model that fails to acknowledge this complexity. They are because they come from very hierarchical and exclusionary structures. So I think it's important that the collective that the feminist leadership builds on intersectionality, that is very important, and it's about, as I said, driving systemic change, and building counterpower. But from an organizational, people and culture perspective, I think it's far beyond gender. I think that's what it's woven into the fabric of the organization, the very essence of the DNA of the organization, and that is what feminist leadership is about. You cannot have, like, I'm quite amazed sometimes. I'm just giving this extra insight. When Black Lives Matter, yeah, BLM, when it happened, there was immediate, kind of a knee-jerk reaction for many organizations to onboard DEI,
Yeah.
diversity, equity, inclusion, and some, of course, belonging also. They had panels, they had global, kind of a steering committee, and all of that, which is great intention, great, yeah. But the understanding here is, if you embrace feminist leadership and if you have feminist principles operating in your organization, you do not need a DEI collective. You don't need a
Right.
separate DEI body, because the essence of feminist leadership and principle is about diversity. It's about equity. It's about
Yeah.
inclusion. It's about celebrating that. It's about power sharing. So I think that's something which we need to go beyond, and that's why I think it goes far beyond gender. Then, of course, the biggest one they say is that, oh, this is woolly stuff. Feminist leadership lacks structure or a clear framework. Because obviously, people don't spend that kind of time. They just hear something about it, and that's it. They feel, yeah, yeah, this must be, I haven't heard anything much, because there hasn't been much research on that, but we have in reality organizations that have very, very detailed feminist leadership competency frameworks, very well structured, embedded into entire life cycle of the organization. And they're able to actually, kind of implement that, measure it, develop it, and create, top class feminist leaders actually in a way, in their practice element. So that I think is there. And then of course, I just want to reiterate that um, Peter Drucker, I think, said, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist. And I think
Right.
for these kind of things, it's very true, in terms of that. Yes, if we don't measure, what is the measure of that practice in terms of its effectiveness, in terms of behavioral change, in terms of the culture journey, in terms of engagement, then I think we are a little bit in that ground where, they'll say, oh, this is bully, but, where is the evidence? Where is your empirical data and so forth? So I think that is a little bit of mm, sorry, drawback. And but and through this podcast, I think I'm very strongly urging like-minded organizations that are perhaps at this time premeditating or already in the journey of embracing feminist leadership and building, feminist leadership, kind of strength and of course the principles to set aside a little bit of, kind of time to get into and collaborate and, maybe even host a longitudinal research or, an action research on the practice of feminist leadership and its impact on organizations. So I think that will really
Mm,
be helpful.
yeah.
So yes, it is not bully, it's very structured. And then the last one is that feminist leadership is anti-hierarchy and impractical for large organizations. So I think actually the whole misconception this is that it is just the opposite. In a sense about that it's impractical for large organization, it's anti-hierarchical. Uh, about anti-hierarchy, that again comes from the embedded patriarchal notion about hierarchy and rank and file and layers and so forth. And when you want to reduce those, and many top companies have done it, where they don't have actually any hierarchy. In fact, some companies they don't even have a role, a job title. It's all teams, so team based. But of course,
Mhm.
they haven't embraced feminist leadership principles for doing that. But they just thought that it makes more business sense to have flat structures. Similarly, in the development structures, I think in terms of the operating models and organizational design, that should be a must in terms of the minimum number of layers and hierarchy. So minimum amount of power that is like that, or minimum amount of power that is now held at different layers, and maximum power that is devolved, and just devolved because through the structure. And if I were to talk about impractical for large organization, I would only refer to one thing. If I were to rank all leadership models on a Likert scale of 1 to 10, um, transformational, transactional, servant leadership, and all of those, situational leadership, and so forth, and feminist leadership. Feminist leadership will end up around 8.5 to 9 on a challenge scale, as opposed to the others that will be teetering at maybe 6 or 7 or maybe 7.5.
What do you mean
I mean,
by
yes, yeah, it'll come to maybe 8 also, but it is it is it is an ask. It is not something that comes organically. That many people actually have this belief that feminist you can become a feminist leader just organically without practice, without practicing those competencies, without living those values every single day. No, you can't. It doesn't happen
mm,
like that. So I think this
mm.
whole myth about anti-hierarchy and implications for large organizations, I think large organizations will run the best with feminist leadership principles embedded into them, because that is
But
where then they'll be able to devolve power, will be able to do meaningful work without the bureaucracy, without the hierarchies, without all the hoops and the loops. Yeah.
super loops. Um, just to punctuate, did I just hear you say that you think that feminist leadership, amongst all the leadership models that you're familiar with, and you're familiar with a lot, that you think it's the most challenging to truly
Yeah.
adopt? That's what I heard you say,
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could imagine that. All right. So in our remaining time, I want to move towards these competencies that you and your colleagues have developed, behavioral level competencies, I'm hoping,
Yes.
right? That these
These all
are.
behavioral. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So what are the and those that, as you said, needs to be promoted and expected throughout people's lifetime in an organization, right? All the way from selecting, hiring, all the way to exiting, etc.
Yeah.
So tell us, what are the most important behavioral competencies that you can actually, where I can see a person enacting it, and where people, and then let's go into how it's promoted, how it's enforced, right? And how it's measured.
So I think that's a very insightful question, because normally at this age now, with AI, advent of AGI, very interesting. David McClellan, came out with this competency framework long back, and it's from the business sector that we have borrowed. So conceptually, we have borrowed that, which is perfect because he only helped us understand what competencies are, and they are behavioral competencies. At least we can say that they are behaviors that we can observe, we can develop, and we can measure. So that's
Mm,
the essence of a competency. So in the feminist perspective, these competencies, therefore, I mean, you can have a generic competency, and that's why I say the age of AI and AGI, but I think they're redundant. Competency frameworks, generic competency frameworks are redundant actually,
they are
because it
now
doesn't make
redundant
sense.
parts.
Redundant, I would say, because they are too generic. They do not talk or do not have the alignment to the values, the mission, the kind of work, the strategy, the strategic indicators, the outcomes, what the organization wants to do in terms of what the organization is all about, the ways of working. Those competencies are frameworks that they feel one size fits all. But
Mm,
these competencies are highly customized. We call it hyper customization actually, and they operate at different role levels, in terms of, obviously, at an expert level, at a professional level, at a semi-professional level, as an entry level, and in that way. So that whole competency practice that goes in the, what we call it, as the continuum scale.
mhm.
And because these are hyper customized, therefore it can get actually to the individual's preferences and be able to enhance many of the practice elements. For example, let's say a simple one. Let's take
Yeah, let's
self-care.
start with one. Let's give some examples. Otherwise, it might be
Yeah,
for me.
you can give an example. So one thing is, let's take the one. Okay, let's connect it this way. Let's take power with. So that's a very important element. Power with. So what is power with? Power with is building the collective. It's a collaboration. So the competency that will kind of uh, be measured, and that will be kind of assessed, will be collaborative, building collaborative relations, for example. So in a generic parlance, it's building collaborative relations. But in the feminist context of a competency framework, that will then be highly customized to say that, okay, if you build collaborative relations, now what is it that you will follow in terms of, okay, the principles? So one is, of course, about the whole element of power with, but then the other powers come in terms of the power to, power with, and power over. And then it looks into the element of, is it like inclusive? What kind of conversations are you having? Have you excluded? What kind of groups are you dealing with? So it's a whole gambit. It does a lot of those, what we call it as in strategies, they do situational analysis. In the competency perspective, you actually do a situational analysis of the context of the competency. So in this case, it is power with, and therefore the competency is collaborative relationship. Then it will again go further to the context of, yeah, specifically, building this coalition, building this collaboration, building the movement, and all those elements will come into play. But
Mhm.
finally, that will be anchored again with the competency of, let's say, a simple competency of using your like expert power, let's say, using,
Mhm.
okay, again, power. So from power over, we're going to expert power now. So
Yeah.
how, in feminist perspective, how do you actually leverage on your expert power, what we call as expertise power? So in the real world, in terms of, if they're not looking into embracing feminist leadership practices, the expertise power, the expert power, they wield a lot of power.
Yes.
They can wield a lot of power. They can actually change things, and it impacts because it's the expertise power, the perception of experts that are sitting somewhere in global north that actually discusses and designs an entire water system based on not the gravity system, based on something else. let's say for a hilly district somewhere in Nepal.
Mm.
So the feminist leadership principles will take that very differently. They will not even go there to global north. They will go
Right.
right down to the point of where the people need water. And that is where a conversation will start. They will look for traditional expertise. They will look for the insights, the wisdom. So it's a very different way of looking at the expert power. The power is devolved. You no longer have expert power to dictate terms to people. I mean, I'm not saying organizations do, but what I'm saying is I'm giving an example of water because water is a fundamental human right, access to water. But you don't need experts to tell you how to access that.
Mm.
No, experts can help you to enable that to access it. But the feminist leadership practice in terms of the competency will be very different. How do you, therefore, kind of build that competency of, let's say, the context of, having, let's say, women. And there are cases where these are women they repair the pumps, for example.
Mhm.
All are women, I'm just saying in that sense, because they are the ones who deal with water the most. Men don't
Yeah.
carry water for miles. So it's the women who are trained, the women engineers, we call them, quote unquote. But that's a very interesting way of empowering. We don't need the experts there. No, no. The women will manage this. And they have. They manage not only water systems, they manage their entire lighting system, the solar power and stuff like that. So the expertise, knowledge is devolved. That is
Mm.
one other competence. But to do that, you need to be competent. How do you transfer knowledge? So an understanding of that is very important. I think another competence, for example, is that where you are able to actually, kind of transfer that knowledge in a meaningful way that adds value without the biases and without being, wielding your power, like,
Mm.
funding a project, for example, which has a situational context. So how will you do that in terms of the allocation of resources, for example? And
Mm.
in a power survey, I think many organizations that I have worked with on power, the number one facet, how people see power is money, money, power, resources, and which is so
Yes.
true. So when we bring on feminist principles, it will flip
Mm.
it on its head because that's your governance structure. That's what I'm saying. An organization that going to embrace feminist leadership principles or going the feminist route becomes a feminist organization. Beware, because it will flip the organization on its head. Your governance structure will change. Your anti-voting rights will change. The way kind of ways of working will change. The entire, interaction with the General Assembly or what the governance structure, the management, the staff, all of that will change. It is, I think, not in turbulence, I would say. It shakes up the organization, and it's a question of the journey. Therefore, is the organization ready for it?
Exactly. Because I have seen some organizations that have embraced this framework, not just rhetorically, but in some other ways, and yet where I see some examples of real old-fashioned use of power over and old boys networks, etc.,
Yeah.
and politics of a kind that is
Mhm.
entirely, I would say, counter to the values behind feminist leadership.
Yeah.
And where some people seem to think that those things can coexist, and to me, that does not seem credible.
You can't. I mean, it's interesting that you talked about boys' club. We also have the girls' club, and that is where the feminist leadership principles and feminist practice looks at deep structures. Where are these
Mm.
deep structures? So in the Steins model, so culture again, when we go back, because it's about culture. So one thing I again and all the time I keep saying is feminist leadership, feminist principle, feminist organizations. If you want to go that route, embed, it is not about the feminist leadership or principle. It's about a culture journey. Your organization's culture is going to get transformed. It's going to change. You will have to, start somewhere, and that change will come.
Mm.
So I think it's very interesting that many people actually onboarded half-heartedly in a way that, yeah, there are some conversations that happen. But how does it, I mean, many organizations actually struggle then to actually do an assessment. Let's say you do a midterm strategy assessment, but you have already embraced feminist leadership and you're doing a midterm. So your 5-year strategy, nowadays it's gone longer, 10 years and all. But anyway, let's say 5 years and you do sometime around the third year, you don't have the right kind of tools to look at capability index of a feminist leadership practice. There are no
Mm.
tools. Like in the corporate sector, we have, let's say, Dave Ulrich's human capability index, framework, where we can figure out the capability of leaders and what they have done and how it's impacted business and bottom line profits, EBIT margins, everything. Here we don't.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
cannot. You do an organization review also, you cannot. You will not be, because we don't have that insight. We don't have that research.
Well, so maybe because we have to bring this interview to a close, and there's so many things I would have liked to ask
Oh
you, but
yeah.
time for. But let's maybe focus in our last substantive bit on metrics, since you emphasized that rightfully, and you just touched upon it again, right?
Yeah.
Assessing whether it's actually being practiced. Have you seen good examples or bad examples where attempts were made to measure to what extent feminist leadership is being practiced?
So I think there are some organizations that have made some progress, and there are others who are on the journey, and then there are others who are not really sure, because this is not easy. So let's say in the behavioral competency framework that we have, as we call it, the feminist leadership competency framework, which is behaviorally anchored, because there are technical competencies also, but you don't need technical competencies to, be embedded into practice of feminist leadership, because
Mm.
that is something, technical. That's again, that's use of power again, expertise power.
Yeah,
So
expert.
it,
Yeah.
if you look at the tenets of, the feminist leadership competency framework, these competencies, as I said, can be hyper customized. First, secondly, there's something called bars, that is behaviorally anchored rating scales. And in one way or the other, by using technology, and I mean, of course, you can do it without also, but if you have an HR system and if you can interface it with AI, this technology, in one way or the other, to a large extent, will be able to, process data, first of all, because you need data, you need evidence, will process insights, and of course, one way or the other, will also be able to give you a kind of a scale of practice. Where are you? Are you at a entry? Are you at like at a para? Are you at a professional? Are you at an evolve? Are you at an expert level? And there
Mm.
are basic outcomes to those practices that needs to be assessed and measured also. Like
Also,
for
so it's
example,
not just self-assessment, right?
assessment. Yeah, I mean there'll be a self-assessment, sure, definitely, but there'll be more like now with technology 24/7, you can get feedback. And that feedback mechanism is curated to the feminist principles and values. So that feedback process comes to that. So, for example, respectful feedback and accountable feedback, for example.
Mm.
Feedback is something which everyone gets, in this world. I mean, they say like there is no such thing in this world as a mistake. There is only feedback. So yeah, sure. But this feedback is a different kind of feedback. It's customized in a way that the feedback actually works on the principles, and it is not about the feedback being given from perspective of a power. It's
Mm.
feedback that is obviously aligned to the feminist practices, but at the same time, it's something which will give you the indicators of your behavior, and it's there. The indicators are very clear. As I said, grade wise, or I'm not, I don't use the word grade because that again is about power. Let's say role wise, and context wise, those competencies can be developed. So they become, very specific. It can be measured. You can get a scale rating for it, and we can also validate that in terms of actually, is it the case? So you have done this for 3 years now. Okay, let's see now whether it has really impacted and what has it impacted. So embedding a lot of things in terms of the culture change and in terms of the organization's development itself, because that's a journey. It goes through the journey in various phases. So yeah,
Yeah.
you can. The measuring aspect is that again the Drucker, so would say if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist, and that is why I think we always get pushback on feminist leadership, because he says, where is the evidence? One question that people ask me, and I'm a very strong advocate of feminist leadership, for me personally, if you ask me, having been in this for last 3 decades, I feel women make far better leaders. When that again, the gender part I'm bringing into, but I'm not saying anything about the men don't. But that is my personal feeling, and therefore we are unable to put that to use in a way, the intersectionality and the measurements and all of that to to actually get to that point of resolution to give that
Mm,
evidence. So that evidence is
yeah,
lacking.
yeah. So that is still an agenda out there. Gosh, there is so much that I wanted to talk about as well, and we didn't get to it. I know you and I will have the chance to have these conversations, but I hope we can
Sure.
maybe delve deeper in the future as well on this. I have to say, Jayanta, just a sidebar, but throughout this whole discussion, I cannot help but think, for instance, here in the US at this moment in time, and we're recording this at the end of February, I I see a resurgence of traditional masculinity, in fact, toxic masculinity of a scale that
Absolutely.
I would not have imagined. So that's a huge kind of counter push that is happening. Not the topic of today, but it kept playing through the back of my mind as we went about masculinity and a sense of threat, etc. Anyway, neither here nor there. Jayanta, how should people find out more about you if they want to learn more about your overall body of work, which is vast, as well as where can they find this feminist leadership competency behavior framework? Is that, behavioral competency framework? Is that something that we can find as a public resource? That you can point people to, and may we put that in the show notes? Where would you point people to you and this work?
Yeah. No, thanks, Tosca. I think, people, and thanks for actually referring, the reference point of some of our conversations actually is emanating from that article which I'd written.
Yeah.
I think it was the practice of feminist leadership, the FLC way, I mean, the feminist leadership competency way. I'm on LinkedIn, so please, anytime just connect. All you got to do is connect, and all of the material that you have mentioned about, that Tosca has mentioned about, is available on my LinkedIn profile in terms of the articles and what I write. And there's a lot of intersectionality of whatever is written there. So it's not just only one topic on feminist leadership practice, but everything is actually linked in one way or the other. In the practice of OD, I've written, about a matrilineal or some of the other aspects about, organizational culture. There is a very interesting article on power and organizational politics. Many
Ah,
organizations do not go that route. They do not want to talk about. That's one fundamental difference. Again, I want to point out for feminist leadership. Feminist leadership does not back away from talking about organizational politics. It says your personal is your political choice is your personal choice, perhaps. You have to take a side. So organizational politics is something which I think because it's about power. It's about how power is wielded and utilized. So I think that's an interesting one. And yes, jbora1@yahoo.com. That's my email. And of course, I would always keep a tab on some of the other things that you post, Tosca, because that I think is some interesting stuff, which I think I always kind of have a look at. So yeah, in terms of just being connecting, and being in touch. And normally yeah, I do writing. I do some writing in terms of issues related to these. So I'm planning to write something quite dramatic for. That's what I don't believe in also, but the International Women's Day that's coming up in March. That every day should be actually celebrated as Women's Day because of the fantastic work that. But anyway, that's something which I wanted to kind of write from a very a feminist perspective, a male feminist. And so just to also close to say that there are not many males around who will go and tomorrow go on their LinkedIn profile and say, I'm a feminist leader. No. Why? It's because of that whole conditioning in their mind. Because anything to do with feminist leadership means that you are feminine. And for people who are homophobic, for example, yeah, they will actually interpret it as something else. So
I know.
that I think is a massive challenge in terms of that. Yes, men can be very good feminist leaders actually, and they must own up. If they are, they should raise their hand.
Yes. Yes. And with that strong call, and also to say that, oh, you tempted me when you started very late in the show, just this reference to organizational politics. That sounds
Yeah.
really interesting as well. So we have a lot more to talk about in the future. Well, thank you, Jayanta, for everything you offered in this interview, and thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode interesting, there are a number of other episodes on feminist leadership in my podcast feed from 2022 at least onwards. So please go and listen to those as well. Did you know that I also have a YouTube channel where you can find this content and more also? I also, before I close, want to give a shout out to another podcast well worth your time if you work in international development and want to enhance your leadership skills, and that is The Modern Humanitarian and Development Leader with Tori Peace as a host. Tori is a seasoned international development practitioner, a leadership coach, and she, in her podcast, offers you practical tips how to empower diverse teams, take control of your time, and achieve more while doing less. So you will find also reference to Tori shows in the podcast. I just want to acknowledge that this is a time of profound and difficult shock change for some nonprofits and NGOs, particularly here in the US this year, 2025. If you do not have the bandwidth or the budget to engage in a longer term consultation process, I also offer one-off advisory calls through my website that you can book directly to maybe give you the space to think through some of the big challenges that you as a leader or manager need to work through. I'm always there. Subscribe to my email list if you want to be the first to know that interesting episodes such as this one are dropping. And with that, I am saying goodbye. See you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.